did you become a Christian? How did it all happen for you?
Oh, I never had like a moment. I don't think I was ever an atheist though. So I remember being raised in a fundamentalist home and not enjoying church, getting picked on at church. All of my people that were nice to me were non-Christians at school. So I kind of drifted that way. But a lot of their arguments were pretty bad. I remember being at the lunch table and people telling me Jesus was based off Horus. And I knew that was nonsense because I liked to study mythology in high school. And I knew that was nonsense. So I thought the arguments against Christianity, maybe just because of chance, were just bad.
What age was that when you
So,
were having those questions? How old were you then?
high school. I don't remember the exact year. I know I had a cousin who was trying to deconvert me subtly, and it kind of worked for a little while, but I didn't want to tell anyone because I told one person at church, and he gave me a Ken handbook, and I was like, yeah, I'm not talking to people anymore because I didn't like it, and I also was a kid, so you don't really want to tell people, like, yeah, I'm changing my views, and you've deconverted me because it can get you worry about how it's going to look. So eventually, I think from reading C.S. Lewis, another apologist named J.P. Holding, and some others, I slowly became a Christian when I was in the military, but it just took a while to get me there.
I guess that gets you into Christianity. And it sounds like from the beginning you had experiences with an apologetics mindset. How did you to get to the point where you are now?
Specifically Christian apologetics. It was just trying to defend my view after I became a Christian. But I mean, the idea of studying to know what, if Christianity is true or not has just been something I don't think I've ever really been without. It's just something that's always fascinated, been interesting to me. So, I mean, even in the early days when people were telling me that Jesus was based off Horus or Krishna or Zeus, I knew that was nonsense because I used to read Norse, Greek, Egyptian mythology, and I knew all that was nonsense. I mean, the only one that threw me for a curveball was Mithra because I didn't know anything about Mithra at the time. But I've always been fascinated by that kind of stuff. So I don't think I've ever really had a point in my life where I wasn't interested in that kind of stuff.
Coming up on, I guess, March 16th on Modern Day Debate, David Wood gets his chance with Matt Dillahunty. And
Oh boy, yeah.
I have a theory about Dillahunty. It's just mine. I don't know. I haven't seen anybody else with this theory. So I think, he's a stage magician. That's his thing. He's trained in how to hold a crowd, right? I think he's a troll. I think he's a character who happens to be, at this point, too invested in the role to ever consider evidence.
I was recently rewatching his debate with Mike Winger last year in preparation for debating him in April. And he brought up an interesting point. He said, like, he was debating someone in Canada. He asked the guy, what would convince you Jesus didn't raise from the dead? And the guy said, well, you could produce Jesus' body. And so Matt said in this debate with Mike Winger, this is like, well, I'm not really convinced that that would actually end Christianity, because I'm sure, he said, I'm convinced there would be some way out of this, that Christians would come up with something like, well, that wasn't Jesus's body, or he was just spiritually raised. And I remember hearing Matt say that, well, that could be true of you also, Matt, that because he likes to say that if God does exist, he would know what evidence would convince me and he would give it. And my reply to that is, how do you know any evidence would convince you, Matt? Maybe God knows there is no evidence that would ever convince you. I mean, as Matt says himself, he's convinced there would be some way out of this for Christians. There's probably some way out of that for atheists too. So no matter what evidence you give Matt, he could find some way out of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I watched that debate with Mike Winger, and I watched Mike's his response video to it as well. And when Mike, what was really interesting to me was Mike showed up prepared. And atheists never come prepared to a debate with a Christian. They don't do research. I've never seen Matt Dillahunty bring anything.
Sometimes they do. Unfortunately for me, there's been a lot of times they don't.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, like when I debated someone named Godless Engineer, he came prepared. The only problem is that throughout the week, he basically accidentally told me all his arguments through his live streams and everything. But I mean, he came prepared at least. He just didn't, I knew all his arguments ahead of time. But yeah, I found a lot of atheists I debate don't come prepared.
I don't think that they take, well, I think some, I need to stop saying all. Let me just say some, these new atheists, especially these YouTube atheists, it seems like they have the mindset that Christianity is obviously not true. It's obviously ridiculous. So all I need to do is show up. All I have to do is show up and tear the arguments down. And when Mike Winger was debating, and Mike, did a lot of preparation, and he prepared with this evidence for this medical evidence for what happened to Jesus on the cross. His argument was very good, and Dillahunty really had nothing to say about that. He didn't respond to any of that evidence other than pretty much like you said. It's just deny. Just deny.
It's just philosophical objections. Those are all just claims. That's not evidence.
Yeah.
If you're going to make an extraordinary claim, you need extraordinary evidence, all of that nonsense. And so it's my debate with him. I'm not debating the historical evidence with him because we're not going to get anywhere with that. So we're going to I want to talk about his philosophical objections to miracles, basically. So that's what we're going to focus on.
You've got another debate coming up with Matt. Is that right?
Yeah, on capturing Christianity in the beginning of April.
Yeah, you've got a lot of patience. I'll give you that. How's David Wood going to attack that? Or what do you think his approach is going to be?
I mean, he's more slick. He's going to try to catch Dillahunty up in his own logical fallacies. I think that's what he'll try to do. But I don't know. He can be a curveball sometimes, and try all sorts of new things. So I mean, you just watch his debate with John Loftus. It's wonderful. It's hilarious. Too,
yeah, I saw that one too. Yeah, it's Wood is awfully entertaining. That's for sure, and he's a smart guy. When I did that debate analysis, I tried to cover your arguments that you made with Matt that night in that debate.
Yeah.
And so
let me first say that I know a lot of that data may have gone over people's heads. I fully understand that. But again, it's a debate. These are not full analysis. I cannot give a full analysis of all the data there. It's just about laying out a brief overview of what you're presenting, hoping more people look into it. I mean, that's the best I can do. And the reason why I did that is because Matt has said for years he wants the best evidence for God's existence. All right, I'm going to give it to you. It's going to go over a lot of people's heads, but it's going to go over your head too, and your audience will notice.
So I was watching this video from the 2016 Isaac Asimov Memorial Debate. It had Neil deGrasse Tyson was the host, David Chalmers, Max Tegmark were there on the dais. It wasn't really a debate. It was just a conversation. And some interesting comments that were made there. David Chalmers said something like, simulation theory is essentially a theory of a secular deity or a naturalistic deity.
I mean, you could put it that way. I mean, simulation theory is the idea, in a layman terms, it's the idea that we are actually existing on a computer simulation somewhere for some advanced society. So think of The Sims. We are a version of The Sims to some advanced intelligence. And so we're just being run on a computer. We're not real ontological people. We are just computer code. So that's simulation theory. Now, I'm not a proponent of simulation theory, despite the popular myth. I'm a proponent of some of the ideas in simulation theory, some correlations there, but I don't believe that we are actually living in a computer.
To me, that seems like a farther reach than God. It seems like
that's the point in a lot of ways, because first of all, it just is a violation of Occam's razor. Yeah. Because if we're being advanced, if everything we know about the physical universe implies it's a simulation on some computer, well, that computer would need to be made of atoms, and if it's made of atoms, it would need to also probably be simulated, unless they have some sort of special atoms where they are not being simulated. So it becomes ad hoc, and so you just have to keep pushing this infinite regress back. If we're being simulated, who's simulating the world that we're being simulated in, and then who's simulating that world, and so far and so forth. So eventually you got to get to a first cause, and then you just get into contingency arguments, which gets you back to God regardless.
Well, I guess irreducible complexity and infinite regression, those are the devils of naturalism. Also, mind and consciousness really confounds naturalism and materialism. They're actually limited in how far they can go or what they can actually do with their science. But
Well, I mean, I think consciousness is one of the hardest problems for materialists, even though they like to pretend that it isn't. I mean, when I talk to materialists sometimes about consciousness, I've had people say, we know consciousness emerges from the brain. We know that
No,
everything is material. And I'm just like, oh, really? Let's get into it then. And when you start talking to them about it, you realize how little they've actually studied with regards to the neuroscience, let alone philosophy of mind. And so consciousness, there's a reason it's called the hard problem, is because for materialists, it's very hard. So yeah, consciousness itself is very mysterious. And if you notice in my debate with Matt Dillahunty, I turned that on his head. As being an idealist, I would argue that consciousness is fundamental. It's the only thing we can know exists, and everything we experience is a phenomenal mental world of qualia, shapes, information. And I asked him, do you have any evidence that beyond the mental experience, our mental worlds, there's actually an ontological substance called matter? And of course, I didn't get a straight answer. But he keeps saying you have to demonstrate this. If God exists, it has to be demonstrated. It has to be demonstrated. And I remember preparing for the debate, and I'm thinking, well, he needs to actually demonstrate matter exists, and it's just not a phenomenal experience like the idealists say. And of course, they can't demonstrate that. So when you get a materialist onto consciousness and what matter is, it really starts to create problems that they don't want to talk about.
I found this quote from Greg Henriques, PhD, author of of A New Unified Theory of Psychology. This article was in Psychology Today, and he made this quote in there. It says, in common parlance, the mind most often refers to the seat of human consciousness, the thinking, feeling I, that seems to be an agentic causal force that is somehow related, but it's also seemingly separable from the body. The computational theory of mind posits that the nervous system is an information processing system, and it allows us, for the first time, to conceptually separate the mind from the brain body. He goes on to say, because we can conceive of the mind as the flow of information through the nervous system. And this flow of information can be conceptually separated from the biophysical matter that makes up the nervous system. Mm-hmm. And so this is how researchers have become fascinated with models of disembodied artificial algorithmic processors that really have little connection with the other elements of mental phenomena. The idea, I guess, is they need to be able to tie consciousness to the brain.
The idea is that could consciousness come from matter, from the material world, or does it come from a personal source that would be conscious, namely what we would call God? Because if it's conscious and it's the source of consciousness, it just would also be conscious like us and therefore be God. And so getting into consciousness itself, it's extremely hard to explain how this could be reducible to matter itself. Now, what I did in my debate with Matt Dillahunty that some people may have been confused about is I turned that on its head. Think of matter itself. Matter itself can reduce to mind or consciousness. Take your shirt. It's red. I'm sure it's soft. It might be warm. All of those are mental experiences. Those things don't exist by themselves. So wetness is not a property of matter that Matt brought up in the debate. Wetness is something that is experienced in mind when you come in contact with water. But wetness is not a property of the water molecules itself. It's the mental experience of water. The idealist just says, well, if literally everything we're experiencing is mental, why don't we just admit that's all that there is? And this idea that and all that matter is just these different informational arrangements of mental experiences. And we like to pretend that it's an ontological substance independent of us. But in reality, it's just this mental information we're processing. And this is why I use analogies like a video game. If you're in a video game and you come to a tree, that tree does not exist independently. If you walk away from the tree and are not looking at it on the screen, it's just computer code. It's not a real tree. There's no real green leaves on it. It's all just when you turn and look at it, the computer code causes certain pixels on the screen to light up to give you the signal of green. It's the illusion, but it's really just information. Likewise, the idealist says, philosophically speaking, when we're looking at matter, that's all it really is. It's this mental experience. So if that's all it is, it turns materialism on its head. Instead of consciousness coming from matter, we argue matter is just informational constructs contingent on consciousness. And so that's one of the things I was pressing about in the debate, and I didn't get a straight answer on it.
There were no straight answers from that side of the table. He seems to also refuse to obey the rules of a debate. But anyway, that's just part of his shtick, I guess.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, towards the end, he basically gave me all my points. He just didn't like the fact that I was titling it God.
Yeah.
I don't understand how anyone could have watched that debate and not see that. And this is something even Braxton Hunter pointed out, is like, Matt basically just, gave in to the conclusion of natural theology. He just doesn't like the title.
It was over early. The problem with naturalism is there's no really a foundation for contemplating or even trying to observe the cause of the simulation or the field. So are you familiar with Rupert Sheldrake and his idea of the morphic field?
Sounds familiar. I'm not sure if I remember what the morphic field is.
Well, it's the idea that if you train a mouse to do a certain trick, another mouse somewhere else in the world or in the field, basically, is going to find that trick easier to learn because another mouse learned it. Sheldrake has done the experiment where, you watch a dog react, and they'll leave a camera in the house, and invariably the dog knows when the owner is coming home ahead of time, whether they're coming home on schedule or not. So this is an experiment that he had done. It's called the idea is called the morphic field. It's his hypothesis of how birds are able to fly in the patterns that they do. I want to see if I can just basically explain what the digital physics argument is actually saying.
Go ahead, and then we'll talk about it, and I can see if I can help out somewhere.
Yeah, the idea is that information is underlying all the matter in the universe, and that information emanates from or is the mind of God. Is that essentially it?
That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
The good news is you don't need to know quantum physics to know the digital physics argument. You can make the argument entirely from philosophical inferences and just an understanding of basic cosmology. So let's just table quantum physics for a minute here. What we are seeing in terms of cosmology is something called the holographic principle.
Yeah.
And what it basically says is when scientists were looking at black holes and they were studying them, the mathematics of them, they found that if like an object, like say my phone, was falling into the black hole, the information on the surface of the black hole, the two-dimensional top surface, is what is actually expanding. So the information of a black hole is not relative to the full volume of it, but to the surface area. So everything that falls into a black hole is kind of like all the information is preserved on the two-dimensional surface of it. And so information of a black hole is relative to its surface area, not its three-dimensional volume. And so that got physicists thinking that, okay, why is it not three-dimensional in that sense? Why is the information being preserved on a two-dimensional sheet? And as Leonard Susskind has pointed out, the physics of black holes is very similar to the physics of the whole universe itself. So they sort of put together this idea called the holographic principle. And what it basically says is everything we know about space-time, the three-dimensional world, all matter and whatnot, it seems to be understood as like a projection of this two-dimensional information like it is on the black hole. So that sounds like a hologram, hence holographic principle. So the classical world we experience, space-time and matter, seem to be emergent from this underlying computational information, whatnot. Now that is supported by other data in quantum mechanics we can get into. But just from the holographic principle alone, we can argue space-time is emergent. Now, if it's emergent, the question, of course, becomes, what is it emergent from? Now, what I do in the digital physics argument is I point out that what physicists say it emerges from is the underlying quantum realm. Now, I don't have to explain quantum physics to get there, but it's this underlying quantum realm. But it's math. But the quantum realm is just mathematical. There's no space there. There's no time there. There's no matter technically there. It's all just sort of like probability waves, which is mathematical because it's about probability. So these mathematical probability waves. Same when people talk about Hilbert space. They talk about they describe the quantum world in terms of Hilbert space, but Hilbert space is not real space. It's just math speak.
Yeah.
You're describing things in terms of math. So to review, universe, holographic principle shows the universe is emergent from the underlying mathematical quantum realm. Okay, how does that get you to God? Second step, when other physicists have studied the way we think, the way we process information in our heads, they have found that can be better described using the rules of quantum mechanics. And this is something called the theory of quantum cognition. And it says that the mind, the way you and I think, is quantum. It acts quantum. Okay, put two and two together. If the universe emerges from an underlying quantum realm, and minds act quantum, okay, put two and two together. The universe emerges from something that is like a mind.
Yeah.
It's just simpler to say it emerges from a mind. So that avoids simulation theory, the idea that we're emerging from a computer. And it gets you directly to what theists have been saying for centuries, where the universe comes from a mind.
We're talking about information, and information comes from a mind. Information can't come from a computer without a mind to establish it.
Technically, yeah. So let's define what we mean by information. So going off C.E. Shannon on a mathematical theory of communication, he says the properties of information is the properties of a system associated with the system's possible configurations. It's not an entity or an ontological class. So in layman terms, if materialism is true, information refers to material arrangements. Different ways I can measure the height, the length, the width of this. That's the information of this physical object. If idealism is true, information refers to phenomenal states, the quality of this, the color, the math, and of course the mathematical information that sort of arranges it there. So sound, sensations, emotions, the mental phenomena itself. So information is not an ontological class. It's not something. When I say the universe emerges from information, I'm not talking about ontology there, because information is not like a substance that matter could emerge from. I mean more the mental information, the mind of God in that sense. So it emerges from a mind, namely his phenomenal states, which would be information in that sense. So physicists will say, like I've heard some physicists talk about how the universe emerges from information. And what they're referring to seems to be the wave function, quantum field theory, that kind of stuff.
Where do we get to, where do we cross over from contingent into necessary? Is information, as the way you've defined it here, it must be contingent, right?
Well, it would have to be, because information by definition is contingent on some sort of ontological substance. I mean, you're going to describe this phone by its information. Information itself is contingent on this phone being there. It's contingent upon it. And so if the universe is emergent from information processing underneath the space-time and matter, the question, of course, what is it emergent from? It can't emerge from matter, because we're talking about what matter emerges from. And again, given the digital physics argument, if it's emerging from information, and that information via the study of quantum cognition matches the way minds act and think and operate, it's just logical to say that it emerges from a mind. Now, a mind is an ontological substance. Okay, there, we've solved the problem right then and there. And that's the most parsimonious understanding of these things. Instead of trying to say, well, we're contingent upon a computer, or there's some sort of underlying ontological substance that we're contingent upon. I don't understand how anyone can be a materialist in light of what we're finding out about basic cosmology using things like the holographic principle, quantum field theory. Even if we get into string theory, there's no escape at this point.
That materialism is dying. It has to be dying with what we're seeing here.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways. There are better alternatives. I mean, I even think Colin McGuinn's theory is much more parsimonious than basic materialism. I've seen some materialists talk about, well, maybe there's some sort of underlying substance that creates the universe, some sort of multiverse kind of thing, or some will appeal to the many worlds interpretation. But I mean, for when I get to the layman materialists who just say that we're all just atoms, they really don't even know what an atom is. I mean, an atom itself is not a ball that's just sort of floating around in space and bumping into things. Once you start looking at what an atom is, you don't even get that kind of little ball that you hope that it is there.
Well, even light. When you think about light and the general idea of a field and how light works, it's just not really well understood. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? How does it actually work?
So we're getting to quantum physics now, and that's a good place to start talking about this, because good way to segue. So when we're talking about atoms, the double slit experiment is a good place to start for people to understand this, because what they found in the double slit experiment is that when they were shooting atoms through a double slit, they were acting as like waves. not individual little balls of matter. And that was perplexing to physicists. So they said, well, let's try shooting one at a time, because maybe they're bouncing off each other and giving the impression they're acting as waves. Well, no, when they shot each atom through one at a time, they were still acting as waves. So they put a detector at the double slit.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we're going to find out why they're acting as waves. When they put a detector at the double slit, the particles didn't act like waves. They act like little balls of matter, concentrated little balls of matter. And so the argument from idealists like myself is that observation creates how the particles will act, whether they're going to act as waves or as particles. And without observation there is just a probability field. This is called the wave function. Now, a wave function is not the particle. A wave function is the probability of where you could find the particle. But here's the really strange stuff, is that the particle is not floating around in the wave function. It's not there yet. It doesn't exist until you observe the wave function. Then you have a collapse and you have a particle. So independent of an observer is just mathematical probability information. There are no physical particles. That gets you back to idealism and a lot of the stuff we're talking about earlier. So as I was saying earlier, you can make the digital physics argument without quantum mechanics, but quantum mechanics really strengthens the digital physics argument, because it shows us all these little balls that we think of or matter are really just probability waves that only appear as matter when they're being observed. In the Schrodinger equation, which describes the wave function, we can describe the evolution of the wave function. There is no equation to describe how it collapses to a particle. That's a problem, because that throws hard determinism out the window right there. There's no more Newtonian determinism because there's no equation to describe what causes collapse. So when people tell me, well, collapse is just when two particles interact, I'm like, okay, stop there. What's the equation to describe that? It doesn't exist. There is no equation to describe how the wave function collapses. End of story. That's why you need observers. That's why quantum field theory is you can't determine when collapse will happen. So if there's no equation to describe collapse mechanism, it's not, the collapse mechanism probably isn't a physical event. It's not something that's happening physical. And that's why physicists like John von Neumann, Henry Stapp have said, eventually you got to get back to consciousness. You're going to get there regardless, because if there is no physical collapse mechanism, it's something beyond the physical consciousness. And that's where they have gone to. And other physicists hate that idea because they want to think of space-time as this interesting little thing we're studying from the outside. We're not affecting it. We're not causing collapse. They want to say that, space-time is a closed system. And that just doesn't seem to be what quantum physics is showing us.
All right. Well, there's another question, another concern. We're talking about the mind of God. How do we establish the difference between the mind of God and what would you call in the occult, the all? How do we determine between, theism and pantheism?
Well, yeah, that's so I did a video on my channel called Christianity and Pantheism. Now, pantheism says all is God. Pantheism says all in God. Now, I would argue that's very consistent with Scripture. Take Acts 17. In him we live and move and have our being. So everything is sort of contingent upon God. In the Greek Orthodox Church, it's this idea called weak pantheism. Now, that's not Hegel pantheism. That's not strong pantheism. Strong pantheism is this idea that the God is sort of discovering himself through the universe. So he's not really omniscient. He's getting to that point. Weak pantheism says, well, you have God's essence. That's omniscient, that's eternal, and that from his external, metaphorically speaking, energies from his essence generates out the universe, contingent creatures and whatnot. So we're contingent on God, but we're not God. A good analogy is, think of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. Sauron is contingent on J.R. Tolkien, but J.R. Tolkien and Sauron are not the same thing. Yeah. We are contingent upon God, but we're just creations of God's mind. And that's very consistent with Scripture, I would say. I think that's basically what Scripture is teaching. I think there is pantheistic aspects in Scripture. That's why the Greek Orthodox Church has taught it. That's why even before the church, and people like Philo of Alexandria were hinting at these kind of ideas. So I think there's nothing wrong there. I just think people need to understand it's pantheism, weak pantheism, not pantheism.
I think a good way to distinguish between the two, or to stay safely over here in biblical Christianity anyway, or just theism, are you looking within yourself, or is it coming from outside of yourself? Because, in the occult or in the New Age, power is inside you. God is inside you. We've forgotten who we are. We've forgotten our origins, or what?
Very Gnostic. Yeah, there are distinctions there. I mean, there's a creator-creature distinction. You can have that in pantheism, especially the Greek Orthodox version. So there's nothing heretical about it. You just have to understand where things are coming from.
But what we see now, what's interesting about this too, this idea of so-called sacred geometry, we see the golden ratio, Fibonacci sequence in nature. Do you see those kind of things as indications, or is that just kind of a coincidence?
I would say that you could use them as indirect evidence, but I try to. One thing I remind myself is that humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We want to look for patterns, and so sometimes I try to overcautious myself about finding patterns just to be on the safe side.
Yeah.
And atheists do it. Atheists are like, look at Inanna, she was hung on a hook. Therefore, that's the same as crucifixion. Yeah. They're trying to find patterns too. So humans are very pattern seeking. There might be something there. I'm not the expert on that, but I try to cautious myself about finding patterns and jumping to conclusions because I'm worried that I might be overstepping.
With all we've said up to now, to what degree do you see the universe as designed?
I'm extremely confident that the universe is emergent from a mind and designed by God. I mean, just take digital physics argument, Leibniz contingency argument, fine-tuning argument, cosmic conscious argument, introspective argument. I mean, just from those, and then I add the argument, argument from reason, the moral argument, resurrection argument, ontological argument. Those are the 9 arguments I tend to use. I mean, just from the 5 I mentioned alone, I mean, there's just a collection of data that supports it. And what atheists tend to do, so you get them in the debates, is they go, well, maybe fine-tuning can be explained as by the multiverse. Maybe consciousness really is emergent from matter. Maybe, maybe there's something we're missing in terms of like where the universe comes from. They multiply entities beyond necessity, and therefore their arguments are not as plausible using the criteria of plausibility. Because they're trying to explain all of this data with different explanation for X, for Y, for Z. We have one explanation for it all. There's a mind behind the universe that we call God. Yeah. That is simpler. That is the least ad hoc. It's the simplest explanation given Occam's razor. I just don't understand how you could deny at this point. I just don't understand why there's not more deists, and it's just
at least more deists, less atheists.
And so when just go back and watch my debate with Matt Dillon. I tell people to do this. Like I'm really happy with how that debate turned out, despite all his fans saying he destroyed me, which I love to read. But
that's what they say. That's their job.
He basically gave me all my premises. He just didn't like the last premise where I said this is what we title this God. I'm sorry, you just basically gave me everything I needed to prove my argument. You just don't want me to use that title because it creates, in his own words, baggage for some people.
Well, yeah.
I mean, to be fair, the very next day on the Atheist Experience, Matt said he thought his opening statements were not that good. So he was honest about it. But I mean, I don't think he brought up the baggage stuff until the end. I could be wrong, but
you're in your opening statement, you did what you're supposed to do as the positive position in the debate. If you're going to win this debate, you'll have to refute these arguments or provide something better. And then the first comment he makes is, well, I'm not going to do what I'm told. What is that?
Yeah, he doesn't like that. And I'm like, well, I mean, that's the way a debate works. I'm presenting the positive.
Just the rules.
Presenting the negative. Show me the problems with the arguments. If he says he's not doing that, there's no debate anymore.
Yeah, it seems like the thesis of a debate is irrelevant. So can you explain your idea of how man is made in the image of God?
So my understanding of the image of God is going to come from Scripture, not science.
Right.
Because
that's good.
Those are two different things. So ask yourself this. I think every Christian should at least agree all humans are the image of God. Every human is the image of God. So my question is if that's some sort of ontological thing or some sort of mental quality, and anytime you try to define that, you're going to get a pro-choice argument because you can always think of a fetus that's not going to be able to reason or have some sort of mental capacity or whatnot. So this is something Michael Heiser has pointed out. In Scripture, the The image of God is not so much this ontological special substance about you. There's nothing special about you that allows you to be the image of God. The reason you're the image of God is because you were elected to be the image of God. Humans were elected to be God's image. It's a relational aspect. We are God's priest kings on earth. We are supposed to govern creation in his name. We are his representatives on earth. They're also in a covenant with him. That's what it means to be the image of God according to Scripture. And if you look at Genesis 1:27 to 28 in the Hebrew, it's very verb dominated. It's very much saying, let man image God. God, we are called to be his imagers. So that's something Heiser has pointed out. So to be the image of God, it doesn't have anything to do with science. I think it's an election point.
Could you say that what the argument is also that God is mind? That's where everything is emergent from. And since we have this consciousness as well, that's how we reflect God too. We have this consciousness, this disembodied essence. Could we be in the image of God because of consciousness? Do we share that with God?
I would say yes, but I would say also all living creatures are technically conscious. Like, I don't deny that my cat is conscious.
Yeah.
I mean, so if you look at like other creatures, like for example, like corvids, I mean, ravens and crows, they're very intelligent. They have an understanding of physics, like folk physics. They are able to communicate with each other. They understand. Some studies have shown they understand gifts and rewards, not only for themselves, but they should give rewards and gifts to other living creatures. So in some studies, ravens have actually brought gifts to the experimenters as appreciation for feeding them. Dolphins have been shown to communicate and reason to develop new tricks. They have taught dolphins not just memorizing new tricks, but to actually be able to reason and come up with new tricks on their own in order to get food. So I'd say all creatures are conscious, and some show levels of intelligence that we didn't think that animals were actually capable of. So that's why I would argue against that idea. The image of God refers to consciousness, because animals are not the image of God in the Bible. Only humans are. What is special about us? We were elected by God to be the image of God.
There's another idea I wanted to finish up with here, and this is theistic evolution. And specifically, we need not be dividing on this issue of evolution. Well, for example, I don't know if you know these guys on this huge YouTube channel, these guys, Good Mythical Morning, and they were both Christians, and they both came out of the faith recently, and they left Christianity. And one of the guys said it was definitely because of evolution and this idea that Genesis must be a literal account of creation, and it just couldn't make sense to him anymore. And that was the impetus for him leaving the faith. So no doubt this move away from faith, moving toward atheism or some other religion, must come from the idea that Genesis has to be interpreted literally. And I think this is dangerous because it divides us when it shouldn't.
I mean, it just makes me think, and I know this will sound harsh. I don't mean it to sound harsh. I mean it as like a wake-up call. But it just shows how delusional some young earth creationists are. They sit around and they go, well, the reason people are leaving the church is because of evolution. We need to fight that. No. The reason people are leaving the church is because you have told them they can't believe in evolution and be a Christian. You've created this giant line between what scientists are saying and what the church is saying with this $120 million arc, and you think you're doing something good. When the world sees Christians fighting evolution on that level, literally millions of dollars supporting the Christian ministries attacking evolution, it creates this myth that you can't be a Christian and believe in evolution. That they're so against each other. And then what a lot of young Christians do is they go to college, they go out in the world, and they go, well, let me just look at the evidence. This is what I've seen a lot of people who've left Christianity. They're just curious, and they want to hear what the other side has to say. And they realize it's actually quite logical. There's a lot of good arguments for it, a lot of good evidence for it. And then they turn around and go, well, how come if this seems through the evidence is supporting it, and Christianity is ultimately opposed to it, well, I got to reject Christianity then because the evidence is so strong in this faith. And it's just silly. If the church would just push this aside, this stupid debate aside, and this is why I will actually travel and debate young earth creationists on this topic, so more people can see that you can be a Christian, be in evolution. But if the young earth creationists just sort of pushed this debate aside and said, look, I don't believe in evolution, but you can obviously be a Christian and believe in it. Let's get to what's really important, the gospel and the resurrection. You'd see a lot less people leaving the church. But no, they think this is like the dividing line, to the point where they have to build a $120 million ark in Kentucky and a $75 million museum to try to combat this thing. And they're just shooting themselves in the foot. I'm sorry, they're shooting themselves in the thigh and bleeding out, and they don't realize it. And so, yeah, it's really quite unfortunate. And I still talk to young earth creationists, and they think I'm the problem. I'm the reason people are leaving the church. It's because I'm telling them it's okay to be a Christian and believe in evolution, if that makes any sense. But there's a lot of delusions in the young earth movement, and they need to wake up and realize what they're really doing. But no, they just get mad at me for it.
And I saw the debate that you did with Kent Hovind, where he said in his opening statement that I'm sorry, you're going to have some trouble on Judgment Day because of your views. And I was thinking, wait a minute, man, that's ridiculous. There's no correlation to the gospel truth and whether or not Genesis is a literal account of creation.
Well, think about what he said there. Think about what it says about him. He says, you don't think like me, so on Judgment Day, God is going to be mad at you because you're not more like me. If he thinks Judgment Day is going to be about him and not Christ, he's on the wrong side. I remember one time I was debating a King James onlyist, and he said, oh, when I get to heaven, God's going to reward, tell me how wonderful I did for only reading the King James. And I said, yeah, you think heaven's going to be about you? You're going to the wrong place. If you're judging people's salvation based on if they think like you or not, that's a very prideful position to hold. It's a very dangerous position to hold. When we get to heaven, I don't think that's the last thing that's going to be on our mind. That's going to be like, oh, whose Legos were those when we were 5? Or whose doll was that when we were 5? It'd be silly kid nonsense at that point. But that's what they think is going to be really important, is you talk about evolution to people.
So there's the idea of micro evolution and macro evolution. But, I don't think I have to make a decision about whether or not macro evolution is the truth or not to be a Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a separate thing. It has nothing to do with Christianity. If I'm going to describe macroevolution, the one thing you got to realize is people tend to think micro and macroevolution are different processes. They're not. Macroevolution is just a bunch of microevolutions plus time. So if you're an old earth creationist, people don't realize this, but if you're an old earth creationist, you already accept all the premises to be a theistic evolutionist. You just don't realize it. You accept time. You accept there's hundreds of millions of years, and you accept microevolution. Microevolution plus time gets you macroevolution. So you accept the premises. And then people say, well, I don't think species change into different species. Neither do I. Neither does anyone who believes in evolution. That no one ever says a dog will eventually produce a non-dog. Every Great Dane will always produce a Great Dane. The difference is that just like every Great Dane is still technically a dog, and every dog is still technically a wolf. Every wolf will always produce a wolf creature, a dog, which is a wolf. Species just divide into subspecies and just keep dividing into subspecies. So every canine will always produce a canine, even though within canines, Great Danes will only produce Great Danes. See, we still inherit everything that our ancestors are. So we're still tetrapods. We are still mammals. We are still great apes. We're still primates. We don't ever become something our ancestors were never. This is why chickens are still dinosaurs, because they evolved from dinosaurs. They're still dinosaurs. So when you eat a chicken nugget, you're eating a dinosaur nugget, technically. Never once did a dinosaur change into a chicken. A chicken is still a dinosaur. So when people say that I don't think species change into new species, which is a big myth young earth creationists have put out, yeah, but that's what the theory of evolution says. If a species ever produced a different species, that would debunk the theory of evolution. So again, if you're an old earth creationist, you already accept the premises of evolution. You accept there's time, millions of years. You accept there's microevolution. Given enough microevolution changes, eventually rabbits and hares will split off and diverge and no longer be able to reproduce, just like they did with pikas. They all look very similar. They all have a common ancestor. They just can't reproduce. Even certain rabbits today cannot reproduce. I mean, Ken Hovind talks about how Florida rabbits and Alaska rabbits cannot reproduce anymore. Yeah, that's evolution. That's how it works. It's just given another 100 millions of years, Florida rabbits and Alaska rabbits will look completely different. And you could have young earth creationists then going, well, there's no evidence these changed into different species. I mean, yeah, because it takes a while.
You know what? I really appreciate the way Frank Turek responds to the question, at least about the age of the earth.
Do you consider yourself to be a young earth creationist?
Okay, I'm absolutely convinced that the universe is at least 53 years old.
For myself, you know what? I kind of like that position. And I just like to listen to what's coming in from both sides. I think also what Michael Heiser says is really important. The Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. So we just need to let the Bible be what it is. And I think that's probably good advice. I appreciate your time and for making the time to come on here and do this with me. It's a big help. I hope we can talk again sometime.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do it. I appreciate coming on.